So, a day long on the first noble truth, fully understanding dukkha. Just last night at the monastery, Tankachana, sitting over here in the chair, gave a reflection for the community. It's our observance day. Yesterday was the new moon observance. And we have an evening program on those days, and usually accompanied by a Dhamma reflection. And one of the things he mentioned was that this kind of approach, using the teachings around dukkha and the ending of dukkha, the Four Noble Truths of the Buddha, is kind of a unique approach in religious traditions, in that this kind of view, what it is that we call the purpose of the teachings, or sort of the structural paradigm, the paradigm of what it is that we're actually trying to do. You know, what's the sort of the orientation, the view of the teachings, is different from many of the other religions that tend to focus on a certain creed, a certain set of beliefs, like and he was referring to the Apostles' Creed from the Christian tradition. I can't remember. I grew up in the Christian tradition, and it was triggering memories, very imperfect memories, but something like, I believe in God the Father, maker of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord. If I can remember, something like that for the few. So it starts out with a very clear line of, I believe this. I believe in God, maker of heaven, all the creation and the being that we call a God, one God. And the Buddha's creed, as you will, or the structure of the view, right view, is more along the lines of these Four Noble Truths, and it's more like observing a condition of experience. The first Noble Truth, there is dukkha, there is suffering, or unsatisfactoriness, stress, depending on how you want to translate that word dukkha. All the way from the lightest forms of things just not being quite right, to the full scale of what can happen in the realm of existence, and particularly as a human being, to various kinds of deep anguish and suffering, pain that we can experience because we're sensitive beings. So that the orientation of all of the Buddha's teachings are around this experience of dukkha, and, importantly, the ending of it. The fact that there is not only this experience of unsatisfactoriness that we all know, but there's also a cause, a reason that it happens, and there is a path, a very clear path that the Buddha laid out, leading to the cessation of suffering, which is also one of the Four Noble Truths, that there is a possibility, at least for a particular kind of dukkha, which we'll go into, to completely cease, that we don't have to experience some of this kind of suffering. And this is essentially what the whole of the teaching is built around. Buddha talks about the Four Noble Truths as the elephant's footprint, just like an elephant footprint in the ground. All the other animals of the forest, their footprints could fit within the footprint of the elephant. Then all the teachings that the Buddha offers can fit into this footprint of the Four Noble Truths. So I thought, obviously one could try and do a day long on all of the Four Noble Truths, but seeing that that's the whole of the teaching and that there's a full canon of teachings that support that, it might be a bit broad, but to focus maybe on the first one, to fully understand it. Because each of these Four Noble Truths If you're familiar with some of the original teachings, like even the very first teaching, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the turning of the wheel of the Dhamma, the Buddha's first discourse that he ever gave, some short time after his enlightenment, is where he expounds the Four Noble Truths, and then also talks about them a little bit in an expanded way, and pointing out that not only are there these Four Noble Truths, but that there's a duty to each one of those noble truths. And for dukkha, the noble truth of there is dukkha, the first noble truth, the duty that the Buddha talks about is to fully understand it. Parinya is the Pali word for full understanding of the noble truth of dukkha. Of course, then the cause of dukkha is something that we have to abandon. That's the duty of the cause of dukkha, is to abandon it. And the cause, or the duty of the third noble truth, the cessation of dukkha, is to realize the cessation of dukkha. And the duty for the for the fourth noble truth, which is also the Eightfold Path, is to develop it. So there's duties associated with each of these Four Noble Truths, but you have to start right at the beginning with fully understanding what it is as a basis for really realizing the ending of it. And that's oftentimes something we don't want to do. We don't want to fully understand and experience something that can be a bit difficult, painful to acknowledge. We just want to go straight to, just give me the cure. Don't tell me about the problem, just give me the cure. But in this case, it doesn't work. If you went to your doctor with a physical problem, and he said, "Oh, I don't care what it is, just take this medicine," you wouldn't feel so trustful, would you? So you'd want him to kind of do a few tests and figure out exactly what the problem is, and that's what we have to do too. So, we spend so much of our lives trying to get things just right, don't we? We really are in this continual search for tweaking our existence in ways to make it just a bit more pleasant, just a bit more easy. In our society, in our culture, we're fortunate enough to have a lot of material well-being for most of us. We generally, I would suspect that most of us in this room, very rarely go hungry or for lack of shelter or the requisites that we need for our general well-being. As opposed to, as we all know, many sectors of the world that are less fortunate than us. But as good as it can get in our lives, and maybe we have very excellent supports and personal relationships, that kind of thing. We're all still here wondering, why is everything not perfect? I want it to be just right. And kind of coming to this understanding of the first noble truth is that inevitably, things are never going to be just right, at least for any length of time. Maybe for short periods of time we can, get that peak moment of perfection. But the imperfection is kind of built into the system because it changes. And that's built into the system, is change. So this kind of dukkha, this referring to the never can get it quite perfect for very long. It's likened to a cart that has wheels on it, but that the wheels are slightly unbalanced, and so the cart is just going along, going kerdunk, 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 and you try and balance the wheels, but you can never get it quite right. Or like I used to be a bicyclist, and we have what's called a truing wheel, or a truing frame, where you stick the wheel up and try and get the wheel so that it rolls straight rather than kind of a little wobbly. And you have to do that by adjusting the spokes and all that kind of stuff. And it's so hard sometimes to get just exactly right. So, the dukkha, the truth of dukkha, is like a wheel that's out of true. It just kind of, it might work, but it's kind of clunky and not quite satisfactory. And it kind of goes against the grain sometimes of, our current. We have a fairly life-affirming culture too. It's good to have positive outlook to life where we don't just constantly focus on the negativity. When I first came across some of the Buddhist teachings, and I think many people do, I think, what a depressing religion this is. There is dukkha, the whole thing. Because sometimes that first noble truth in popular literature, for people who aren't really familiar with the tradition, but talking about it, they'll translate it as life is dukkha. Life is suffering. Who wants to hang on to that, kind of belief? But it's kind of a misinterpretation, a mistranslation of that first noble truth, more along the lines of what I said of there is dukkha, as opposed to life is dukkha. But we are a life-affirming culture. We want to always look at only what's pleasant. There was a book that I read a few years ago that was really great. It's kind of a fairly wry look at the aging and dying process with a woman who's a cartoonist I think she was for the New Yorker, Roz something, I can't remember her name, but the name of the book is Can't we please talk about something more pleasant? Referring to the conversations that she would be having with her mother, who was getting very old, very sick, and in the process of dying at some point, and her mother's response to this woman's wish to kind of like, we need to talk about this, we need to come to grips, we need to face reality here, and her mother's typical response of, well, can't we just talk about something more pleasant? It's a great book if you're into that kind of humor. It's sort of like we don't want to go there as a society anyway. I also remember, this will date me a little bit. I remember when this book I think it was one of the first books on transactional analysis, TA, came out, and it was called I'm Okay, You're Okay. Anybody remember that? I was always pleasantly pleased with the kind of a little commentary that came on it that somebody with a wry sense of humor said or came up with as an alternative title that really described the true experience of our lives more accurately with I'm not okay and you're not okay, but that's okay. So I think that's kind of what it is that we're looking towards for fully understanding dukkha, fully understanding this first noble truth of just kind of realizing that, I'm not okay. This isn't okay. Everything isn't perfect. You're not okay. Really, to some extent, more or less, we're all in a mess. And that's okay. This is the truth of human life. And if we can really realize that and get that on a deep level, then it's great. We don't need to talk anymore. That's really the full aspect of understanding this, penetrating this. So in that first teaching from the Buddha, he introduces this concept of dukkha, this unsatisfactoriness, and describes it briefly when he's talking about the first noble truth. And he goes into a few examples of what dukkha is, for those of you who are familiar with the teaching. And it's something we chant regularly. And in fact, that section of that sutta, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, that section where it describes what dukkha is part of our, incorporated into our daily morning chanting as well. So he talked about, well, okay, there is this noble truth of suffering or unsatisfactoriness. There is this noble truth of dukkha. Birth is dukkha, aging is dukkha, death is dukkha. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are dukkha. Association with the disliked is dukkha. Separation from the liked is dukkha. Not getting what we want is dukkha. And then something that we'll tease out a bit more later is, in brief, the 5 focuses of what we say the grasping mind, or the 5 focuses of identity, or more like the 5 aggregates affected by clinging, the body, the 5 aggregates to make up what we call ourselves, the body and the mind. I'll go into more detail later. As they are affected by clinging or attachment, those are dukkha. So that's right up front. He kind of lays out some of the groundwork of what is dukkha. And then in the teachings, dukkha is talked about in a number of different ways. It's described in a number of different ways. But basically, it's really important, and it's part of the deep penetration, the deep understanding of this dukkha, is that essentially there's 2 kinds of difficulty, 2 kinds of unsatisfactoriness that we experience in the world. That which is kind of an inherent part of existence, that just by being a sentient being in this conditioned realm of existence, particularly a human being, there are things that are going to be inherently unpleasant, and that really are just part of nature. Then there's a second kind of dukkha, which is what the Buddha talks about, the dukkha of the Four Noble Truths, which is a kind of dukkha that we do not have to experience, but that we continually renew and refresh and bring into our lives, of essentially how we hold our lives and how we move through the world and how we react to the conditions, pleasant and unpleasant, that come into our lives. The first kind is a dukkha that's inherent within, as I was saying, the 5 khandhas. And the second kind is also associated with the 5 khandhas, but the 5 khandhas affected by clinging. So there's a difference in these 2 kinds of dukkha, that part of this full understanding is being able to recognize and differentiate between these 2 basic kinds of dukkha. Because the first one we just have to learn how to accept with grace. The second one we don't need to experience. And this is what the Buddha was talking about. And in a lot of ways it's the most painful one. So just to go back a little bit, just to, in case people are a bit unfamiliar with the 5 khandhas, translated also as the 5 aggregates of experience. And it's often these five khandhas is how we define ourselves. If we're going to define ourselves in some way, we define ourselves within in one or more or all of these 5 categories of these 5 aggregates. So the first khandha, the first aggregate, is the aggregate of form. This body, generally, in our own experience, is what we're talking about. With its flesh and blood and all the components, the earth elements, the solid elements, the liquid elements, as often is described, the 4 elements of this material body: air and heat. This is the experience of form. This is an aggregate, what we call an aggregate of experience. A heap or a bundle. Khandha is a heap or a bundle. And then the the other four ones are more aggregates of the experience of mind, beginning with the aggregate of Vedana, or feeling. Better, I think, translated as feeling tone, rather than just feeling, because it doesn't refer to actual sensation of the body, but more the feeling tone of any physical or mental experience as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So this is what's called the aggregate of feeling, as part of our mental experience. Everything that we come in contact with through our senses is either pleasant, has a tone associated with it of some sort, even if it's very mild. It's pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And this is an important distinction in our practice, because we can see that how, depending on what that feeling tone is of our mental world, where our mind is drawn to. And that's what we're starting to get a handle on, is how our mind is moved in experience. And if something is pleasant, we're moved towards it. We want to go and get it, right? If something is nice, we see something beautiful, or hear something beautiful, or smell something, our tendency is, the underlying tendency is to reach out to get it as a pleasant sense experience. If something's unpleasant, we find it repulsive, or it's just jarring to the senses, then the tendency of the mind is to want to resist, move away from, get away from, don't want it, annihilate. And if it's neutral, if it seems to not pull our minds one way or the other too strongly, we tend just not to even notice it. And that's a huge amount of our experience, is how much of the world around us do we just not even experience or know, because it's fairly neutral in terms of its feeling tone. So this is why the Buddha talked, I think, about noticing this part of our experience and defining it as a separate aggregate of mental experience, because it does so much to keep us pulling out into the world. So that's the second khandha of feeling, tone, Vedana. The third is our perceptual process, perceptions, sanya, and these are the ways we classify the world around us and try and make sense of the world around us. It's based in memory, so that there's always the experience of, say, if we're talking about a visual perception, we can see an image, colors, lights, and forms that are just very basic as they hit the eye. But then it moves into the mental world of a memory. It's sort of like, oh, I've seen one of those before. That's a human being. Oh, not only is it a human being, but it's of this age or this appearance or of this gender, however it is that we're conditioned to classify experience. And then all of a sudden we're labeling, human being, male, female, old, young, whatever. And then even more, oh, that's somebody I recognize even more. That's Joe or Sally or whoever. So this is all part of the perceptual process. It's how we classify, organize, and make sense of what could be a chaotic world. And it's a very subjective process. How we classify information is totally based on conditioning. And so our experience of the world may be completely different from the experience of somebody sitting right beside us, because it's all based on memory and experience. So that's perception. The fourth khandha, fourth aggregate of what's called mental formations or volitional formations, are things like thoughts, emotions, things that we generate from whatever we are experiencing, usually in the perceptual or the physical world. So the actual verbal thinking process is part of these volitional formations, or all of the intentions, the thrusts of mind to act, to think, to act. All the intentions that we form to speak, those kinds of things are all part of this volitional formations, this productive side of the mind. And then the fifth one is consciousness itself, this basic discriminative awareness that lands continuously on one of the sense bases, like sight, sounds, tastes, that brings our sense of attention and awareness into any realm of experience. And it's our conscious component of our mind that weaves together through all the sights and sounds and tastes and thoughts, weaves together continuously a reality that tries to have some sort of consistency to it. So this is the conscious activity. So these 5 aggregates are what we generally tend to assume as who we are, either individually or in combination or as a sum total. We take all of these body and mind objects and we add an additional layer of experience that we call me, or I, or self. So I take that, I just want to introduce that briefly. This isn't a full foray into the experience of the 5 khandhas, but it's important because it's making this differentiation of this experience of body and mind and seeing the dukkha that's associated with it, that we have to differentiate between this as a natural condition and the kind of dukkha that we can do something about, which is all of these 5 constituents, when they're accompanied by this sense of grasping, holding, attachment to any of these 5 khandhas. That's when we run into the trouble that we can start to loosen up around and experience the release from that kind of dukkha. So, some of those things that I rattled off from the Dhammacakka Sutta, birth is dukkha, aging is dukkha, etc. Some of those in that list are, most of them in the list are, what we were talking about as these kinds of part of the fundamental characteristic of nature that we just experience because we're born into being a human being. Birth, aging, and death. There aren't too many. In fact, I can't think of anybody over the age of around 120 that has that has lived longer than that. So, birth, aging, and death are subject to this experience of dukkha. The birth process. We tend to romanticize it a bit. I've never had any kids of my own, but my sister had a couple of them, and I can remember her description of the birth process, giving birth, and it's an interesting mixture, and you hear the reports of the people who were in there at the same time, and it sounds pretty awful, actually. And I think the only equivalent that I think a male human being can relate to in that sense is what I've heard is passing a kidney stone. Sometimes describe that as male childbirth. But it's that level of pretty intense discomfort that a person goes through. And my sister does have the memory of, she's saying, it's like my mind just reverted to this animalistic state. She said it was quite weird. But then, we have the blessings of hormones like oxytocin that kind of like pump in there, right after the birth, and all the sense of well-being, and it helps kind of obliterate some of the memories of it. We have these incredible biological systems that help us through these systems. It's like I had a medical procedure done not too long ago, and they gave me this medicine called Versed, which is it's a tranquilizer of some sorts, but it also has the effect of amnesia. It wipes out your memory of any event, so that you're kind of conscious during this procedure and you can follow directions, but and it can be uncomfortable and you might respond to some painful stimuli, but you don't remember any of it. So we have these built-in systems of obliterating our memory of unpleasant experience at times like that sometimes. So. And for the baby who's being born, moving from a womb out into the scariness of the outside world and all the jarring sounds and experiences. Birth is dukkha. It's not a pleasant experience. And as many of us are starting to experience, aging has its issues too that we try not to look at. The denial of aging. You can see it in all the magazines that constantly tout the advantages of youthfulness and beauty and how to take care of all the signs of aging that we would rather not be happening. Not only the physical decline of physical energy and the diseases that sometimes come along with old age, but the loss of what we would normally call attractive aspects, the sagging, the wrinkles, the gray hairs, you name it, we've all got it. It's all happening. But how the culture and the media kind of constantly tries to pretend it's not happening. The denial of aging, the denial of death, of course, is the biggie. Just our culture wanting to hide it, put it away, keep it confined to, nursing homes and hospitals, and just, more recently how our culture is starting to, at least some of us are starting to be a little bit more conscious about that. And maybe that a lot of the pain we face in our lives is this pretending that it's not going to happen, and that it's better to see reality as it is, take care of it, take care of our loved ones rather than sending them off to somewhere else, so that we don't have to live that reality of death. Part of being a human being. And then just the physical pain that the body has to go through. These bodies have nerves, they have, different kinds of diseases, and they can be painful. And we have lots of good medicines these days, but still to some extent there isn't an escape. The same painful situations of the loss of loved ones through death, separation, divorce, whatever. It's a fundamental characteristic of human life. And there's no way that we can control all the people that we have in our lives. Inevitably, unless we have extremely sterile, isolated, controlled lives, we're going to be encountering people who are unpleasant. And we're going to be separated from those who are pleasant. So it's just part of being a human being in society. There's things that happen that are difficult, people that we have to deal with that are difficult, because nobody's the same. We all are trying to, in some ways, maximize our own pleasure, and that sometimes is at odds with other people. So these are kinds of experiences that, if we really look at it honestly, there's not too much that we can do about it, except learn how to react skillfully. Not that we're ever going to stop this body from aging. We're not going to stop the body from dying. We're not going to prevent all kinds of pain. We're not going to be able to hold on to people that we love and want to be around us. We're not going to be able to ward off all the unpleasant situations and all the unpleasant interactions with other people. It's just not going to happen. And if we can realize that, then we're a long way towards really understanding the true nature of our lives and how to be with that. Just to enter into the realm of the suttas and some of the teachings along these lines, the Buddha talks about 3 kinds of this kind of dukkha, just as a way of helping us to categorize, classify as a step towards understanding this kind of dukkha that's inherent within the experience of the 5 khandhas. And it's what he calls the dukkha that's in relation to also the three characteristics of anicca, dukkha, anatta. Most of you have probably heard that category of the three characteristics of existence: anicca, dukkha, anatta, impermanence, suffering or unsatisfactoriness, and not self. So this is the kind of dukkha that we're talking about. It's the dukkha of the realm of conditioned experience that's inherent within conditioned experience. So there's three kinds of that dukkha. Dukkha. The first one is called dukkha, dukkata. And the word dukkha is actually an adjective meaning unsatisfactory. Dukkata is actually more of the abstract noun of unsatisfactoriness. So dukkha, dukkata refers to just this experience of painful feeling, usually physical, but can be mental as well. The painful feeling of having a human body, having a human mind. Unavoidable. The second kind he refers to as viparinama dukkata, which is specifically the dukkha or the unsatisfactoriness of when something pleasant ends, as it will. Pleasant feeling always changes. All feelings always change. But this kind of viparinama dukkata is the dukkha of pleasant feeling changing to unpleasant, or just in its fading. When it fades away, there's a sense of unsatisfactoriness of dukkha, even if it doesn't turn into something grossly unpleasant. There's a sense of, oh, well, that was nice, and now it's over. So, there's kind of this inherent dukkha built into even pleasant experience because it will change. The third kind is the more broad kind called sankhara dukkata. And it's basically the dukkha or the unsatisfactoriness that's inherent in all conditions, sankhara being fabrications or formations, which are essentially the constituents of the conditioned realm. And that it's referring to that dukkha that's inherent because none of these things in our world, in our experience, none of these fabrications of body and mind have a permanence to them, there's nowhere where you can take permanent refuge in anything that's of a conditioned nature because it will change. That is one of the truths of this conditioned realm. And with that unpredictability, that instability of experience is a sense of unsatisfactoriness. We're looking for something stable. We're looking for something where we can really ultimately rest. And it's not to be found in the realm of conditions. Even in the most pleasant, long-lasting realm of conditions, there is change. So all of these are of the five khandhas in and of themselves. I'm going to read a little, just give people a flavor of the direct quotes from the Samyutta Nikaya. This is one of the collections of Buddha's teachings. This is the what's called the connected discourses of the Buddha, and this one is from the collection on feeling tone Vedana that I was talking about. It's called the Dart. Oops, this seemed to. Oh, here we go. Yeah, here we go. I won't read the whole thing. I'm just going to read some excerpts of it. Bhikkhus, or monks, when the uninstructed worldling is being contacted by a painful feeling, he sorrows, grieves, and laments. He weeps, beating his breast, and becomes distraught. He feels two feelings, a bodily one and a mental one. Suppose they were to strike a man with a dart, and then they would strike him immediately afterwards with a second dart, so that the man would feel a feeling caused by two darts. So too, when the uninstructed worldling is being contacted by a painful feeling, he feels two feelings, a bodily one and a mental one. Being contacted by that same painful feeling, he harbors aversion towards it. When he harbors aversion towards painful feeling, the underlying tendency to aversion towards painful feeling lies behind this. Being contacted by painful feeling, he seeks delight in sensual pleasure. For what reason? Because the uninstructed worldling does not know of any escape from painful feeling other than sensual pleasure. When he seeks delight in sensual pleasure, the underlying tendency to lust for pleasant feeling lies behind this. He does not understand as it really is the origin and passing away, the gratification, the danger, and the escape in the case of these feelings. When he does not understand these things, the underlying tendency to ignorance in regard to neither painful nor pleasant feeling lies behind this. If he feels a pleasant feeling, he feels it attached. If he feels a painful feeling, he feels it attached. If he feels a neither painful nor pleasant feeling, he feels it attached. This bhikkhus is called an uninstructed worldling who is attached to birth, aging, and death, who is attached to sorrow, lamentation, pain, displeasure, and despair, who is attached to suffering, I say. Bhikkhus, when the instructed noble disciple is contacted by a painful feeling, he does not sorrow, grieve, or lament. He does not weep, beating his breast, and become distraught. He feels one feeling, a bodily one, not a mental one. Suppose they were to strike a man with a dart, but they would not strike him immediately afterwards with a second dart, so that the man would feel a feeling caused by one dart only. So too, when the instructed noble disciple is contacted by a painful feeling, he feels one feeling, a bodily one, not a mental one. Being contacted by that same painful feeling, he harbors no aversion towards it. Since he harbors no aversion towards painful feeling, the underlying tendency to aversion towards painful feeling does not lie behind this. He does not seek delight in sensual pleasure. For what reason? Because the instructed noble disciple knows of an escape from painful feeling other than sensual pleasure. Since he does not seek delight in sensual pleasure, the underlying tendency to lust for pleasant feeling does not lie behind it. He understands as it really is the origin and the passing away, the gratification, the danger, and the escape in the sense of these feelings. Since he understands these things, the underlying tendency to ignorance in regard to neither painful nor pleasant feeling does not lie behind this. If he feels a pleasant feeling, he feels it detached. If he feels a painful feeling, he feels it detached. If he feels a neither painful nor pleasant feeling, he feels it detached. This, bhikkhus, is called a noble disciple who is detached from birth, aging, and death, who is detached from sorrow, lamentation, pain, displeasure, and despair, who is detached from suffering, I say. So sometimes when we hear the word detached, we kind of think of like indifferent or, kind of like spaced out or avoidant. But that's not the use of this word. The word detached or non-attached doesn't mean not experiencing. We still experience. The instructed noble disciple still feels, still experiences, even, certain mental states or emotional movements can be known and experienced, but it's without this sense of adhering, clinging, being bound up with to the point of resisting or getting absorbed in. It's with a sense of clarity and understanding and a sense of knowing and experiencing fully, but not getting sucked into it with ignorance. So I think that's one of my favorite teachings is this teaching on the two darts, because it kind of points to this reality that pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. We don't have to add that second layer of dukkha to normal human experience. And we can really see and understand how, if we can fully understand the difference between the two, that we can come to accept what is reality and what's out there, and not have to experience all the unnecessary layers that we add on to it. And kind of owning up to this truth. Some people, again, will say, "Oh, this is, it's really depressing." You have to sit here and kind of explore and get into and move into your dukkha. But if you do it with wisdom and clarity, and with the knowledge that there is this release from it, once it's fully understood, this possibility of release, then what a tremendous relief! It's like the truth will set you free. It's like our avoidance of the truth is what causes us pain in the world. And then once we can delayer ourselves from this way we complicate experience, and just settle back into, as Ajahn Sumedho would say, understanding the way it is, then there is an incredible amount of freedom that we can experience. So this is what the Buddha's teachings are pointing to, and what the First Noble Truth particularly is pointing to. Fully understanding this kind of dukkha and penetrating it is, probably one of the most significant parts of the training. And just to realize that the human condition is, in a sense, a very natural one, and we don't have to complicate it with our complicated minds.